Modern navigation is an extraordinarily recent invention in the context of human evolutionary history. GPS satellites have existed for barely 4 decades. The magnetic compass, in its earliest documented form, is roughly 2,000 years old. Paper maps with any real geographic accuracy are younger still. For the overwhelming majority of the roughly 300,000 years that anatomically modern humans have existed, and for the far longer span of time that earlier members of the genus Homo moved across landscapes before that, every journey ever taken by a human being was completed without a compass, without a map, and without any instrument that could tell a person where north was. And yet the species did not simply survive under these conditions. It expanded across the entire habitable surface of the planet, crossed open ocean with no land visible in any direction, and reliably found its way back to specific, previously visited locations across distances that would challenge a modern hiker equipped with a satellite device. How does a species without instruments manage the full range of navigational challenges that modern tools exist to solve? Direction finding, distance estimation, route memory across years or decades, the ability to return to an exact location after being displaced by weather, injury, or pursuit. These are not minor problems. They are survival-critical problems that the compass and the map were eventually invented to solve. The answer is a layered system, biological, cognitive, environmental, and social, that is considerably more sophisticated than the simple image of ancient people wandering and occasionally getting lucky suggests. Let's go through it properly. Start with the brain, because the human brain itself is the first and most fundamental navigation technology, and it is far better at this than most modern people, dulled by decades of turn-by-turn directions, ever get to experience. In the 1970s, neuroscientist John O'Keefe discovered a specific population of neurons in the hippocampus that fire only when an animal occupies a specific location in space. He called them place cells, and the discovery eventually earned a share of a Nobel Prize. Decades later, researchers May Britt and Edvard Moser identified a second population of neurons in a neighboring brain region that fire in a repeating hexagonal grid pattern as an animal moves through an environment, functioning as an internal coordinate system. Together, these cell populations form what neuroscientists now describe as the brain's own built-in mapping system, a biological GPS that constructs and constantly updates a spatial model of the surrounding environment without any conscious effort from the person doing the navigating. This system is not a modern accident. It evolved over tens of millions of years across the mammalian lineage precisely because animals that could reliably return to food sources, water sources, and safe sleeping locations survived at higher rates than animals that could not. Humans inherited an unusually well-developed version of this system, and the archaeological and ethnographic record suggests it was pushed to a level of precision that modern urban life rarely demands of it. But biology has limits. A cognitive map built from place cells and grid cells is powerful at the scale of a familiar landscape, the territory a person walks through regularly. It does not, by itself, solve the much harder problem of navigating across hundreds of kilometers of unfamiliar terrain, or across open water where there are no landmarks for the hippocampus to anchor onto at all. The behavioral and technological supplement to the biological navigation system was not optional. It was the difference between a group successfully relocating to new territory and a group becoming permanently, fatally lost. The first and most important behavioral adaptation for large-scale navigation was landmark chaining, and it is worth examining in its specific mechanics rather than treating it as an obvious footnote. A landmark chain is a sequence of distinctive features: a split boulder, a lone dead tree, a particular bend in a river, a distinctively shaped hill silhouette, memorized in order and associated with the specific direction and approximate distance to travel between each one. This sounds simple, but the cognitive load is substantial. A functional landmark chain across even a modest 100-kilometer route might require dozens of distinct memorized features, each one useless without the correct sequence and the correct directional relationship to its neighbors. Anthropologists studying hunter-gatherer groups with no written language have documented navigators who could accurately describe landmark chains spanning routes they had walked only once, years earlier, with directional accuracy that modern researchers equipped with GPS units later confirmed was correct too, within a small margin of error. To make landmark chains reliable across years and across generations, many groups developed structured verbal sequences, essentially memorized narrative routes, in which the order of landmarks was fixed into a repeatable spoken pattern that made the information far easier to retain and transmit accurately than an unstructured list would be. This is a well-documented memory technique found independently across unrelated cultures on multiple continents, functionally similar to what modern memory researchers call the method of loci, in which unfamiliar information is anchored to a mentally walked sequence of locations to make it dramatically easier to recall in the correct order. Ancient navigators were not consciously applying laboratory psychology. They had independently discovered, through practical necessity, one of the most effective memory techniques the human brain is capable of, because a landmark chain that could not be reliably remembered and correctly transmitted to the next generation was navigational information that would eventually be lost, at exactly the moment a group needed it most. Now, let's talk about celestial navigation, because the night sky provided a navigational reference system available to essentially every human population on Earth, and the sophistication with which ancient people used it is consistently underestimated. Stars rise and set in highly predictable positions that shift gradually and predictably with the seasons. A navigator who has memorized which stars rise near true north, which constellations appear low on a particular horizon at a particular time of year, and how the position of specific stars changes across the night, has access to a directional reference accurate enough to hold a course across open terrain or open water for hours at a stretch. This was not casual stargazing. Ethnographic accounts of traditional Pacific Island navigators describe individuals who had memorized the rising and setting points of more than 30 distinct stars along the horizon, using each one as a temporary directional marker as it rose, then switching to the next star in the sequence as the first climbed too high in the sky to be useful, maintaining a continuous, unbroken bearing across an entire night of travel with no instrument beyond memory and careful observation. The most demonstrable evidence of the sophistication of ancient non-instrument navigation comes from the sea. Genetic and archaeological evidence indicates that human populations reached the Australian continent by at least 65,000 years ago, a journey that required deliberate, repeated crossings of open water gaps of at minimum 70 to 100 kilometers, with no land visible from either shore for a significant portion of the crossing. This was not an accidental drift on a single lucky current. The scale of the population that successfully established itself on the far side indicates multiple successful crossings, meaning multiple successful return trips or communications of route information, meaning a navigational system reliable enough to be used repeatedly rather than once by chance. Thousands of years later, the expansion of seafaring populations across the vast distances of the Pacific Ocean, eventually reaching remote islands separated from their nearest neighbors by more than 1,000 kilometers of open water in every direction, represents one of the most demanding navigational achievements in human history, accomplished using star positions, ocean swell direction, cloud formations, and the flight patterns of land-nesting birds as a fully integrated instrument-free navigation system. Wave and swell reading deserves specific attention here because it is one of the least intuitive and most impressive components of the ancient navigational toolkit. Ocean swells generated by distant, stable wind systems travel in consistent directions across enormous distances, often maintaining their pattern for thousands of kilometers after the wind that created them has died down. A trained navigator lying in the hull of a small vessel could distinguish the primary swell direction from smaller, more chaotic local wave patterns through subtle differences in rhythm and the way the vessel's motion changed. Using this deep water swell as a directional reference even in conditions of total cloud cover that hid every star. Traditional Pacific navigation traditions maintained by individuals such as Maupi Ailuk, whose knowledge was documented and studied extensively by researchers in the 20th century after most such traditions had nearly disappeared. Describe distinguishing as many as 4 or 5 separate simultaneous swell patterns arriving from different directions and using the interaction between them as a continuously updating directional check independent of the sky entirely. Now let's talk about the animal and environmental indicator dimension, because the landscape itself was full of navigational information that experienced observers learned to read with a precision that modern navigation instruments have made largely unnecessary and therefore largely forgotten. Land-nesting seabirds fly out to sea in the morning to feed and return to land each evening, meaning their flight direction at dawn and dusk functions as a reliable indicator of the nearest coastline, sometimes detectable from more than 30 kilometers offshore, well beyond the point where land itself becomes visible. Cloud formations frequently build in distinctive patterns above islands due to the interaction between ocean-cooled air and the warmer air rising off land, creating a visible marker of land's location from considerable distance even when the island itself remains below the horizon. Prevailing wind direction, largely consistent across seasons in many regions, provided a directional check that required no visual reference at all, detectable through wind on the skin even in darkness or fog. On land, the asymmetric growth patterns of vegetation influenced by prevailing wind and sunlight, the behavior of specific animal species relative to water sources, and the direction of prevailing drainage patterns in a landscape all functioned as redundant, cross-checkable sources of directional and locational information for navigators who had spent a lifetime learning to read them. Now let's talk about distance estimation, because knowing which direction to travel is only half the problem. A navigator also needs to know how far they have gone, and ancient wayfinders developed remarkably precise methods for tracking this without any mechanical instrument at all. On foot, experienced travelers developed an internalized sense of pace count, an ability to estimate distance covered based on the number of steps taken and the elapsed time, calibrated over years of walking familiar routes until the estimate became accurate enough to predict, within a reasonable margin, exactly when a known landmark should appear. On open water, where there was no ground to pace across, navigators relied on a technique functionally identical to what later maritime traditions would call dead reckoning, tracking elapsed time since departure, combined with an estimated speed derived from watching the vessel's wake, the rate at which foam or debris passed the hull, or the perceived rate at which a fixed star appeared to shift position overhead. By continuously updating estimated position based on speed, heading, and elapsed time, a navigator could maintain a running mental model of location even across many consecutive days without ever sighting land, correcting that model whenever a star, a swell shift, or a bird sighting offered new information. This is not a crude approximation. Modern researchers who have studied traditional navigators performing real ocean crossings without instruments have found their dead reckon position estimates accurate to within a small number of nautical miles across journeys lasting more than a week. A level of precision that required not just skill, but an extraordinary, sustained concentration maintained across days of minimal sleep. Time itself, in the absence of any clock, was tracked using the position of the sun during daylight, and a rotating sequence of memorized star positions at night, each portion of the night sky associated with an approximate hour as it rose and crossed the sky in its predictable nightly arc. This allowed navigators to synchronize elapsed time estimates with positional estimates, essentially running two independent navigational calculations, one based on the sky and one based on perceived speed and heading, and checking them against each other for consistency the same way the redundant environmental indicators were cross-checked against one another. A single individual's accumulated navigational knowledge, however extensive, dies with that individual unless it is deliberately and reliably transmitted. Groups that maintained structured teaching relationships, in which experienced navigators trained successors over years of accompanied travel before those successors were trusted to navigate independently, preserved navigational accuracy across generations. Groups that failed to maintain this transmission chain, whether through population loss, social disruption, or simple failure to prioritize the training, experienced measurable degradation in navigational reliability within a single generation, a pattern well documented in cases where traditional wayfinding knowledge nearly disappeared entirely before deliberate revival efforts in the 20th century reconstructed and retaught it from the handful of practitioners who still retained it. The knowledge itself was not simple to transmit. Extended apprenticeships lasting years, during which a trainee accompanied an experienced navigator on real journeys, absorbing star patterns, swell behavior, and landmark sequences through direct, repeated observation rather than abstract instruction, were the standard method across multiple unrelated navigational traditions. Because the information was too complex and too dependent on integrated sensory judgment to be transmitted any other way. The archaeological record provides independent confirmation that this level of navigational reliability existed on land as well as at sea, long before any of it was written down. Stone tool assemblages from multiple Middle Stone Age sites in Africa, dated to well over 100,000 years ago, include raw materials sourced from specific quarry locations more than 200 kilometers from where the finished tools were eventually discarded. This is not evidence of accidental wandering. Consistent. Repeated use of the same distant source over long periods indicates that specific groups knew exactly where that source was, could travel to it deliberately, and could return, carrying the material back into territory they considered home. A group capable of doing this once by chance would not produce the consistent, repeated pattern the archaeological record actually shows. It requires a reliable method of finding a specific point in the landscape, repeatedly, across the working lives of multiple individuals, which is itself indirect but compelling evidence of exactly the kind of landmark-based, cross-checked navigational system described above operating on land, long before any comparable evidence exists for watercraft. Now let's talk about the seasonal dimension, because ancient navigation was not a fixed uniform skill set applied identically year-round. It was a flexible system that had to account for the fact that stars shift position with the seasons, that prevailing winds and ocean currents reverse or weaken at predictable points in the annual cycle, and that landmark visibility itself changes with vegetation growth, seasonal flooding, and snow cover. A navigator's mental model was never static. It was continuously updated against a known seasonal calendar, itself memorized and transmitted with the same care as the landmark chains and star sequences, so that a star pattern correctly used to hold a bearing in one season would be recognized as unreliable and swapped for the correct seasonal alternative in another. This seasonal calibration was, in effect, a second layer of redundancy sitting on top of the directional and distance estimation systems already described, ensuring that the navigator's tools remained accurate not just moment to moment, but month to month and year to year. Now let's talk about the redundancy built into the entire system, because this is the aspect of ancient navigation that is most consistently underestimated, and that explains why the system was reliable enough to support journeys with genuinely fatal consequences for failure. No single technique in the ancient navigational toolkit was used in isolation. A navigator crossing open water was simultaneously tracking star position, swell direction, wind direction, cloud formations, and bird behavior, cross-checking each source of information against the others and noting discrepancies that might indicate a current had pushed the vessel off course. This redundancy meant that the failure of any single indicator, clouds obscuring the stars, a shift in the wind, did not mean the loss of the entire navigational system. It meant a temporary reliance on the remaining indicators until conditions allowed the others to be reintegrated. This is, in a very real functional sense, exactly the kind of layered, fault-tolerant design that modern engineers deliberately build into critical navigation systems, except that ancient navigators developed it through generations of accumulated practical knowledge rather than formal engineering principles. Now, let's talk about something that connects all of the individual navigational strategies into a coherent whole: the role of accumulated environmental knowledge in making the entire system viable across the full range of conditions ancient humans needed to travel through. Every element of the navigation system required knowing things: which stars rose in which position during which season, which swell direction indicated which distant island, which cloud formations meant land and which meant nothing at all, which bird species could be trusted as a directional indicator and which could not. This knowledge was not general. It was specific to each environment, each stretch of ocean, each landscape, and it took years, sometimes decades, to accumulate and refine to a level of reliability that could be trusted with a group's survival. A navigator arriving in genuinely unfamiliar waters had to rebuild significant portions of this knowledge from careful observation, and the groups that survived long-distance expansion into new territory were consistently the ones with the most rigorous systems for accumulating, cross-checking, and transmitting this knowledge before committing to journeys where failure meant death. And this is ultimately the answer to the question of how ancient humans found their way without instruments. They navigated through a system that was, in its totality, as sophisticated as the compass and the satellite, just distributed across biology, memory, observation, and social transmission rather than concentrated in a physical device. The hippocampus was the positioning system. The landmark chain was the route programmed into it. The stars were the compass heading. The ocean swell was the backup compass when the sky failed. The birds and the clouds were the proximity alert. And the apprenticeship, the years spent traveling beside someone who already knew, was the manual that made all of it usable by the next generation. The instrument did not replace ignorance with direction. It concentrated a set of distributed human capacities into a single device, and allowed the deep, cross-checked, redundant knowledge that had once made every individual navigator remarkably self-sufficient to gradually stop being necessary, which is either an extraordinary convenience or a significant loss, depending on how you look at it. Probably both.